President Obama delivering an emotional speech at the memorial ceremony for the slain Dallas police officers. George W. Bush also speaking at the event. We will play the highlights and then discuss where we as a nation go from here. Then a retired NYPD lieutenant here to discuss policing and how officers are dealing with these trying times that they're facing. Also, Bernie Sanders finally endorses Hillary Clinton, but will his followers follow along and give her a bump? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it was a busy news day. We start this evening with the interfaith tribute for the 5 fallen officers in Dallas. The stage had the pictures of the 5 officers who were murdered, and the front row had 5 empty chairs with just American flags and the officers' empty hats. President Obama, he capped it off with a 40-minute speech. President sharing some personal stories about the victims, then addressing the racial divide in America.
The deepest fault lines of our democracy have suddenly been exposed, perhaps even widened. And although we know that such divisions are not new, though they've surely been worse in even the recent past, that offers us little comfort. Faced with this violence, we wonder if the divides of race in America can ever be bridged. We wonder if an African-American community that feels unfairly targeted by police and police departments that feel unfairly maligned for doing their jobs can ever understand each other's experience. We turn on the TV or surf the internet and we can watch positions harden and lines drawn, and people retreat to their respective corners. And politicians calculate how to grab attention or avoid the fallout. We see all this, and it's hard not to think sometimes that the center won't hold and that things might get worse. I understand. I understand how Americans are feeling. But Dallas, I'm here to say we must reject such despair. I'm here to insist that we are not as divided as we seem.
Then he directly addressed the people who've been demonstrating against the police.
Protesters, you know it. You know how dangerous some of the communities where these police officers serve are. And you pretend as if there's no context. These things we know to be true. And if we cannot even talk about these things, if we cannot talk honestly and openly, not just in the comfort of our own circles, but with those who look different than us or bring a different perspective, then we will never break this dangerous cycle. In the end, it's not about finding policies that work. It's about forging consensus and fighting cynicism and finding the will to make change.
Also, we had former President George W. Bush, who is a Dallas resident. He spoke as well.
With their deaths, we have lost so much. We are grief-stricken, heartbroken, and forever grateful. Every officer has accepted a calling that sets them apart. Most of us imagine if the moment called for that we would risk our lives to protect a spouse or a child. Those wearing the uniform assume that risk for the safety of strangers. They and their families share the unspoken knowledge that each new day can bring new dangers. But none of us were prepared or could be prepared for an ambush by hatred and malice. The shock of this evil still has not faded.
Want to bring in my panel now. We're joined by Franklin Richardson. He's a senior pastor of the Grace Baptist Church in Mount Vernon. Andrew Whitman to his side, our senior political correspondent. We're joined by retired NYPD Lieutenant Darren Porcher and Scott Vanderhoff, is a former 5-term Republican Rockland County executive and co-chairman of the Palisades Institute of Dominican College, and fellow Rockland resident Dominic Carter, political journalist and author in his own right. Gentlemen, thank you. I'll get to the policing part of it in the next segment, but what the president said today, he said an open and honest conversation is what we need to have. Do you think we're ready for an open and honest conversation, a really open and honest conversation in this country?
I think we have no alternative. I think it's something that cannot be avoided. I think the sequence of circumstances that have come to our community and to our nation require us and force us into dialogue and into challenging conversation. That does not mean that the solutions are on the table. I think we are wading through the brokenness to try to find what is the healing place. Where's the balance place?
Well, let me start with you. I'm sure you had an interesting conversation with your congregants this past weekend. What are you hearing? I'm sure there's anger and I'm sure there's sadness, but there's also, I'm sure, some context with what happened in Dallas. What did you hear on Sunday?
Well, unfortunately, you mentioned it, Sunday morning at the end of the service, we took and had the young adults take over the pulpit and had a panel where they started talking. One young lady started, college students who started with a poem about how she's walking in the same footsteps and the same blood and the same tears of those who were slaves, or those who marched in 54, or those who marched in 64. This cycle is repeated over and over again. And young people are despaired, many of them are despaired about the circumstance and are probing for answers and looking for the solutions.
But I'm not dating you. You've seen different generations of this.
Yes.
Is it really the same as the 60s? Is it really, I mean, think about, we saw a president today, obviously from what was inconceivable a generation.
It's not the same, but it's made harder because many people had presumed that this was over. It's like we've been through that, we thought that was over. And instead it continues to resurface. We think we are fighting fights that we already had solved. We thought that the fight of having to defend the dignity of black people was over. And now it resurfaces and it brings up all of the hidden anger and frustrations that come on. You know, the real challenge of this moment is to live in the space between policemen who killed a black man, what appeared to be unfairly, and policemen who got killed protecting the right to protest. Yeah. That is the tension of this moment. That is a new tension. And yes, we live in a better place now. We live in a place, but Obama being president does not eliminate the realities of the struggle that continues. He's not the answer. That was never the answer. The answer was that somebody who's not president had the same rights, hadn't had the privilege of being president, didn't have a college education, but at the very raw basis, the humanity is equal and valued.
Lieutenant, you're in an interesting spot here. And in fact, last night, we brought on our chaplain for a police department who also is a minister to his own flock here and the different perspectives. You were a lieutenant in the NYPD. I'm sure a part of you broke when you saw those 5 officers' funerals. We saw cops from all over the country coming of all different colors. But in the same point, you're a black man in America. Talk about what it's been like for you since what you saw happen in Dallas.
It's a very interesting dynamic in that the Reverend hit it on the head in that you have one instances where you had 5 officers that were murdered, but then you have a second instance where we had 2 separate isolated shootings that appeared to be an abuse of force. Now, the police, and then me being an African-American male, as you mentioned, so the police, when I wear my police hat, I say to myself, oh, this is an atrocity. 5 officers came to work. All they did was they just signed up to come to work to protect people that were exercising their First Amendment rights. And then you have the other side that whereas you had these 2 individuals that were lost their lives at the hands of police in states far from Dallas. None of these incidents, believe it or not, you have to look at them separately and distinctively.
Okay.
However, as an African American,
do you look at though what happened in Dallas is the act of a madman, or as a cop, do you say, hey, I saw what happened to Officer Lewis's partner, Officer Ramos. I've seen what's happened before. We're targets now as cops. This is different than it was 5, 10 years ago.
Well, I see it as the act of a madman. But what I also see happen is the act of a madman is being looped into an organization which we refer to as Black Lives Matter. And you have to detach the two entities. They're not one and the same. So you have a lot of police officers that will view the organization of Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization. If you look at what Rudy Giuliani mentioned, he said this is a terrorist and racist organization. However, the two are separate and distinct entities. And police officers are very unique in that they can fall on in either side of the fence. As an African American, the most African American officers are going to understand and identify that the narrative that Black Lives Matter is presenting is one that has been something that's going on for a while, in that we need to affect change in connection with police and community relations. You have Caucasian officers that completely see this as a radical racist organization. Now you have the two entities. You have African American officers and you have Caucasian officers that are having this discourse in the station house, and it can be there can be a lot of energy in this particular in this particular discourse. However, at the end of the day, as the Reverend mentioned, we as police officers have to understand the ultimate responsibility is providing police protection for individuals in society, no matter what their color or group is.
2016, you walk into the projects, you yourself in a uniform. Are you the enemy, or is you seen, or how are you seen there?
It's interesting because when we look at what FBI Director James Comey stated in connection with what happened in Ferguson, there was a there was a theory that's referred to as the Ferguson effect, in that you had a lot of officers that believed that they should regress because the communities hate them. Now, that being said, he believed, Director Comey believed, that officers wouldn't be as willing to assist from a proactive perspective individuals that lived in these urban communities. Me going into a housing project in 2016, I see that as an urban area. Remember, I'm an African American male. I lived in housing projects, so I would go out of my way to protect those individuals.
I know you would, but how are you seen there as a cop?
Would I be seen as the enemy? I'm sure that you will have a lot of people that feel that way. However, unfortunately, this is an aspect of policing that's been experienced for years and years and years. So you have to get through it and provide the best protection that you can to those civilians and citizens in those areas or those developments.
You know, Dominic, we make snap judgments, and media is no better. Sometimes even the worst of all. Certain news cycles make things seem like the end of the world, and then you have a 48-hour window and it's forgotten. I'm not putting this story in that context, but nonetheless, it's a tragedy. But are things as bad as they seem right now?
Yes, it's been right beneath the surface for a very long time, and as somebody who's in the projects at least once a week, remember, black folks need police protection as well. So they don't look, in my opinion, at all cops as the enemy. When people need help, 911, we all want the police to respond. That's whether you're black, white, Latino, Asian, whatever. It's when people feel that they're noticing something that's an injustice, when they're being disrespected. So to answer your question, Richard, it's horrible what has happened. 5 innocent police officers, the point that's already been made, lost their lives. Then you have the situation in Minnesota, you have the situation in Louisiana, and you have video that's capturing all of this. That's the difference. I could give you a million cases, but they've never been able to be substantiated because all we had was the police version. They reached for a gun. They reached for their wallet. We thought it was a gun. We feared for our lives. They pulled a knife. That was the account that went down in history. Now, with video, we're seeing a completely different story. So that's why it's a bad situation now more than ever.
I can only imagine some of the conversations you must have heard in the past week, because as folks may or may not know, Rockland County, I would say from a per capita basis, probably has more cops and firefighters for that as residents in a county than as almost any in the United States. In fact, guys that worked with the NYPD. What's been the reaction since Dallas? Like, you know, enough, we've had it. What have you heard?
You know, I think it's all over the place. I mean, I really do. I think there's a real sensitivity to what is going on with respect to police violence. But I think, and I'm not as close as I used to be to hearing more about it, but I think if you take the comments made before, one of the things I think that should be pointed out is the president, I thought, gave a very good delivery today. I don't think he's been on that good on any of the other issues, but he said something I think is very meaningful to the Reverend's point. And that is, in this instance, it's the protesters and the police are on the same side. Exactly. They're on the same side. It's the wild man. It's the evil who is different and who is wrong. And it seems to me that people, at least in Rockland, can react to that to protect the right to protest. One of the greatest things I thought in terms of visual effect is when Black Lives Matter protesters ended up with opponents at the end, and they all began to hug each other. They began to hug each other, holding different views about exactly where they all stood. And I think the president I think it was one of the most important speeches of his career. I didn't agree with all of it, but I thought his point was, there are evil people. But protesters and police are working, for the most part, should be on the same side here. And, you know, there's always been a tension. There is racial prejudice in this country, and it's in Rockland County. And the dialogue needs to take place. But we've also, I think, we've dramatized this so much that we have placed ourselves in a position not to talk about it with some subjectivity. We're over the top. And I think one of the other points that the president made I thought was awfully good was, we are not divided as we may seem. Yes. Okay? So I think speaking perhaps for Rockland County residents, but also for myself, there was a lot in this president's speech, even to the point where he said, my speech doesn't matter as much as the actions of people after it's over.
You know, Andrew, the president said in there, we need an open and an honest conversation. And maybe I'm wrong, but I've said, be careful what you ask for. Because there is so much, it's like a scab, right? And as soon as you peel it back, the rawness comes out. And are we really ready for that conversation? And if this president can't facilitate it, who can?
I think we're ready to talk. I question how ready people are to listen, which is the less recognized part of an effective conversation. And I think you actually got an example of that during the president's speech today. There were a number of moments during the conversation when he was talking about the actions of the protesters, where the police officers were clapping, but some of the other faces that were behind the president weren't. And then again, when you flipped and you talked about the actions of the police department, roles were reversed. There were moments during the speech where everybody was applauding, but people are still seem to be entrenched in their position and who's on the other side of the argument with them. And I'm not sure that people are ready to listen fully to what each side is saying, and that's the only way that any conversation can actually lead to something productive.
You know, I think one of the bad things that happened was that after the killing of the two in Minnesota and Louisiana, this tragedy happened to kill those policemen, because that flipped the whole perspective of the conversation.
And it was so raw what was going on still in those
Split the
two
conversation.
We'll take a quick.
See, that's where I think the emotional. This is a guy who is nuts.
It is.
Okay, he's a madman.
Yes.
And yet out there, the protesters and that woman whose children and she were being protected by the police are the images we don't get enough of.
Yes, yes, yes.
And the Dallas Police Force, their chief, I think, is a hero in this. Chief
wonderful.
Brown is. I think if anybody can. In my opinion, anybody can raise this dialogue to a point of talking about law enforcement.
Well,
he's one.
I want to talk about law enforcement and policing in this day and age. When we come back, we will hear from the Dallas Chief of Police, and I thought it was incredibly thoughtful and also provocative comments. Then we'll talk about policing and what officers are facing on the streets, how they're dealing with their communities, and are things getting a lot worse out there? All that straight ahead.